Hello, friends, and welcome to another edition of Transformational Astrology. I'm Henry Seltzer, and we want to talk about the full moon that's coming up on Monday, which is really coming up soon. And let's go and take a look at the chart. So here we have it. You can see that we're using the natural houses, starting with Aries, all the way around to Neptune. All the way around to Pisces. And the interesting thing also about this full moon degree is that it's very close to the border of the next sign. So that actually in the time passages software, we have an option, and it is an option, just to make that clear, in the display options, where we have a 3-degree house margin. So this you can call the 3-degree rule, or sometimes it's referred to as the 5-degree rule, which is indicating that because, let's talk about the sun, being in 27 degrees of Leo, it's so close to the Virgo 0 mark, which happens to be the 6th house cusp, that we're putting it in the 6th house. In other words, it's conjunct the cusp, very close to the 6th house. I like to do this because I really think it's accurate. Especially if you have something right on the midheaven, but it's still in Sag, it's still a midheaven object, or same thing if it's right on, well, here's another example. So Neptune, 29 degrees of Pisces. It was, when it turned retrograde, 29 degrees Pisces, 55 minutes. So it was really very close to the 0 point, or the Aries point. The 0 Aries, 0 degrees of Aries. So the fact of the matter is it really does affect, if you happen to be somebody that has, in terms of whole sign houses, an Aries ascendant, it really does affect your identity as much as it affects, also you could consider it to be a 12th house, to partake of the 12th house, and especially these guys which are right on the edge of 3 degrees, you could consider them as being part of the Leo house, depending on where that lands in your chart. And also, of course, the Aquarius. But I like to put them over the border like this because it really does show something important, that because this is, even if they're whole sign houses, and by the way, we have an option for that. So in the preferences for display preferences, the 3-degree house margin also has an apply to whole sign houses. If we take that off, you see they become, just part of the Leo house. So we can apply that to whole sign houses. And that's the situation we have here. Just to try to explain why this 27 degree mark is located over the edge of the 6th house in Virgo. Same thing over the edge of the Pisces house as well. So what do we have here? Very interestingly, we have the sun opposite the moon at 27 degrees, and we have Uranus at 27 degrees of Taurus, which can be thought of as being in the Gemini house, and that is a T-square, very close T-square from the sun and moon in this full moon to Uranus. So the meaning that we would get out of that is we would understand that the Uranus factor, you can consider Uranus to be coming from left field, kind of a surprise. You can say also surprising realizations or revelations even. And I associate it also with intuition. I think many astrologers associate Uranus with intuition, meaning that the information can come from a very unexpected direction, which may be from deep inside you, almost unconsciously, just intuitive information. And I also frequently quote the Grateful Dead lyric, once in a while you can get shown the light in the strangest of places if you look at it right. So just to stay open, what we say about Uranus is stay open to possibilities. Everything that comes up, it may seem at first as though it's peripheral. It may seem like, this is a coincidence. That synchronicity is another factor that comes with strong Uranus. So we can pay attention to these things as Monday rolls around, as the last 2 weeks of this Virgo cycle rolls around, and we are looking at, not the Virgo cycle, a Leo cycle. The moon will be in Virgo after 3 more days after the new moon. But the cycle we're in is the Leo cycle. And as that comes to a close over the next couple of weeks, you see, there will be, a surprise factor that we don't know. There's been a lot of surprises, actually, especially if we look at the national scene. It's been a kind of a surprise thing with the Democrats, with Kamala Harris doing so well all of a sudden. It was a month ago, kind of down in the dumps. On the 21st of July was when Joe Biden said, you know what, I think Kamala Harris will be the next president, not me. I'm getting along, shuffling around. I'm not always seeing the cue cards right, and I'm getting names mixed up, and maybe she's a better one to be the leader, be the avatar, the one that stands for what our country's about, what our country is. And she's representing, to a certain extent, a degree of compassion and straightforwardness versus the other guy. We don't want to take sides, although, I do have a preference myself for the Democrats, I will say. So we want to talk about what else is to be said about this full moon configuration that has the sun and moon opposite, perfect T-square to Uranus. And interestingly, there's another T-square in this configuration formed by Venus at 18 degrees of Virgo, corresponding to the midpoint of Jupiter-Mars. Now, Jupiter-Mars in Gemini has been featured in the previous new moon, and now it's featured, even though Mars has moved on. Mars was ahead of Jupiter, now it's a little past Jupiter. But that you can see that 1719, we still have a 18-degree mark, and we have a partile connection to that from Venus, and we have 17-degree mark of Saturn. So that's another T-square, more specifically to Jupiter. And in fact, what we need to point out here, of course, too, is that Saturn is 17 degrees Pisces, 28 minutes in retrograde motion. And Jupiter is 17 degrees of Gemini and 26 minutes. So this is very exact to a couple of minutes of a degree, the square between Jupiter and Saturn. And I think this is kind of interesting from a mundane perspective, mundane astrology, because we know that these are the social planets, Jupiter and Saturn. So Jupiter-Saturn square, being so precise just in the timing of this full moon, tells me that there is a sort of a political sense of things that are happening right now. And it does turn out to be the day of the Democratic National Convention, which, as I say, this full moon, of course, initiates the final 2 weeks of the August cycle. And then also the fact that Jupiter and Saturn are so closely square does indicate to me that it's kind of a political cycle these last 2 weeks, and it does make some sense that at least that's what's coming down. There are world events. It's not just this country. It's not just the U.S. We have a very, very serious situation in the Middle East, which you could think of again as a clash of ideologies. You can think of it as something that can be resolved, hopefully, everybody hopes, in a diplomatic fashion. That becomes problematic, with the players involved, being Hamas, being Iran, being Hezbollah, being Israel, and it's a dire situation, and we're just all hoping and praying that can be resolved without a further escalation of that armed conflict. So it is a political time all over the world. Ukraine, interestingly, has just made a move that was the first of its kind in this war that's been going on now for a couple of years, where they've invaded Russia, a little part of Russia close to Ukraine. And Russia's throwing all these missiles over the border into Ukraine. So if Ukraine makes some advances into Russia, maybe that's kind of a balance point, I don't know. But that's another one we'd like to see resolved in some kind of a fashion without killing more innocent people, all the bloodshed, all the civilians that are being harmed in that conflict. So, and Europe is on fire because of the situation in Ukraine to some extent. various things are happening in England. I think the Prime Minister changed. So, there's always stuff going on, but it does seem like it is a very political time right now, and we have this full moon kind of showing us about that. The fact that we see Venus as part of this configuration brings up a couple things. One is, because Libra is the balance point of Aries, the natural houses, Venus does represent to some extent a balance, which we also see in the full moon. So we could say that there is the possibility of balance, the possibility of diplomatic activity as part of what's happening on the world scene right now. So that is something to think about. We could think about in our individual charts, that this full moon hits it, we can look at how it hits our chart. We can think about Venus, which would be the ruler of Taurus, the ruler of Libra, and therefore ruling at least a couple of houses within our chart. So there again, that would be something to think about, or just relationships in general. The fact that Saturn's involved, there could be a slowing down. Saturn is the contracting planet, and the commitment planet also. Slow down, the water moves slowly, it sinks in. The water's moving fast down the ditch, it doesn't sink in. That's the effect of Saturn, to slow things down so that there can be more absorption and there's lessons to be learned. Those lessons might involve relationship, they might involve our aesthetics in another way, they might involve wherever Taurus lands on the cusp of a house in your natal chart, wherever Libra lands. Like if you have a Libra rising, for example, this is going to be a particularly strong full moon for you. Another factor in this whole thing, besides the fact that we have this strong T-square to Uranus, we also look at this. We have 26 degrees of Leo is the Mercury point, so that is actually also making the square to Uranus, and we may see, and of course Mercury's retrograde. The retrograde started right at the very beginning of the month, on the 4th of August, and it will be retrograde until the 28th of August, but then at that 28th of August, that's the station, so it will be very slow. It will still be kind of a retrograde situation for the next couple of weeks as it slowly gets back. It goes to 21 degrees of Leo, slowly gets back to where it was at 4 degrees of Virgo when it retrograded. That passage takes a couple of weeks, and it will be the 11th of September by the time it gets back to, and then we say it recovers the lost zodiacal ground. So that is the period of what we call the post-retrograde shadow of Mercury. And that can still be some of the similar symptoms of Mercury retrograde: introspection. You may see things going south that you don't expect. You may see miscommunications. You may see mechanical breakdowns. All those things are kind of symptoms of the fact that our internal logic is not moving the way it normally does, but rather it's moving the other way. So we might see a few more of those symptoms heading into September until, towards the 11th it gets straightened out again. Maybe the 10th, which is a quarter moon, might be straightened out again. So that's the Mercury component, that it is Mercury with Uranus. We say we have a lot of wild communications, a lot of wild ideas. We may tend to confuse people by trying to say too many things at once, all at the same time, possibly, because Uranus has a little bit of that effect. Now, one thing I'd like to bring up also in regard to this square, because when we look at the square between Jupiter and Saturn, we want to think about the origin of this conjunction, the previous conjunction, which goes all the way back to December of 2020. And I have the chart here. So here's the Capricorn solstice for DC, December 21st, 2020 at 5 in the morning. And the interesting thing is we have both the Capricorn solstice at 0, we have Mercury conjunct the Sun, and we also have that conjunction at 0 degrees of Aquarius of Jupiter and Saturn in an air sign. And that signals, it's a new 20-year cycle, so that signals this whole period of the 2020s and the 2030s, and we have some kind of turning point that we may be reaching. And I'd like to call your attention to the fact that this was the time of the contention of the election results of 2020, which, as we know, went a certain way. And as we know, it wasn't altogether satisfactory to the Republicans, who felt that maybe they should have won. So, and then they tried to overturn that result. So this has been a very contentious period of time, this solstice that was on the December 21st mark of 2020. And interestingly, I mean, I just find it kind of fascinating that here we have the full moon of the 19th, just when the Democratic National Convention, with the successor to the Biden first-term presidency in Kamala Harris. So that's a very significant moment to see this Saturn-Jupiter being such a perfect square in the full moon timing. In the opening of this PDT, it's 11:26, so it would be 8:26 in the morning on the East Coast. Well, actually, it's not taking place on the East Coast. It's taking place in Chicago. But you get the idea. This is a very interesting time that we're in, a time to pay attention, a time to think carefully, a time to maybe look into, I always say also, I've been bringing it up lately, with Haumea at 0 degrees of Scorpio. With Pluto at 0 degrees of Aquarius, we have this very strong Haumea-Pluto square, and Haumea has a lot to do with connection to nature, but also with telling the truth and figuring out what's the right thing, taking a moral stance. This is the right thing. I feel it deeply. This is the right thing. So when we see it with Pluto like this, it brings up the dark side of that, or how it can go wrong. And I always say it has to do with lies coming, to roost. The chickens coming home to roost, as far as liars getting recognized for what they're doing, and that's a lot to do with the Kamala Harris campaign. Also, Harris Wall's ticket as trying to expose falsehoods, in case there are any on the side of the Republicans, and that's all I'll say about that. So, I think this is a very interesting and very dynamic full moon. We do have a pretty strong configuration here. I meant to mention a little bit more about Jupiter and Mars. In Gemini, that's a very strong. It's been in the new moon and also in the full moon, Jupiter and Mars together. So there's a certain amount of intellectual activity going on. The fact that we're in Gemini with a very strong Jupiter-Mars, the midpoint being part of this whole T-square. So I think that's very interesting as well, to just meditate on the idea of discernment, the idea of thoughtful approach, the idea of communication, which is Gemini, the idea of thinking our way through. So that's another factor that comes up in this full moon, and depending on where Gemini lands, or where this particular degree of 17, 18, 19 lands in your chart, could be a very powerful time. Those with Gemini Ascendant or Gemini Sun sign might feel the energy. It's a strong energy there, which has been this whole month, actually, since August 4th. So I think I'll end there. I think that's good for now. So let's transition back. And just to say that these are fraught times. There's still the joy. We have that strong Jupiter, and there is a certain amount of joy in the equation right now. But it is also a very fraught time and a very difficult time for the world to be living through, and for each one of us. And all we can do is the best we can. All we can do is just try the best we can to do the right thing, what we think is right, to enunciate where we stand, which is has to do with Eris, which is a feminine warrior for soul intention, being also pretty prominent in these times also. So that's it. Good luck with that, and the end of summer, and enjoy. All right, take care, bye.